G'day, I'm Alister Christie from LearnDelphi.tv. Check out my website for many more training videos on using Delphi. This video is on anti-patterns in Delphi, and we're going to cover as many fragments of problematic code as we can in the half hour we have available. As I have gone over time, we're going to get straight into it without any more preamble. The first anti-pattern we're going to look at, I've labelled the stutter anti-pattern, basically because we're repeating fragments of code unnecessarily, or that is to say we've got some code which actually does nothing. So you could also call it the redundant code pattern or something like that. There's probably an official name for it, but I've not investigated. I have a sample method here. It's fairly straightforward. Basically we're creating a string list, doing some sort of processing, and then freeing the string list. Now the bit that I want to call your attention to initially is these two lines of code here. So if assigned x, x.free or free and null x. And if I control click on free and null, we see here that it's creating a temporary reference to our object, and then setting our object to nil, our original reference, and then freeing the object. And free, this is what gets executed because this is a Windows app rather than a mobile application, and we've not got auto-reference counting. So we are checking to see if self is nil, that is to say our object is nil, and if it's not, we are freeing it or destroying it. So if we come back here, and we can't control click on assigned because it's buried quite deep in the runtime library, but in the help we see that assigned corresponds to the test. P is not equal to nil, or in our case my list is not equal to nil. So effectively we're saying if my list is not equal to nil, if my list is not equal to nil, then free. So it's basically that line of code is completely redundant. A little bit more we can do. My list is a public variable. So this is another sort of common Delphi anti-pattern, and that's having too large a scope on your variables or classes or whatever. So we could shift this. It should be at least protected, but we can make it private if it's not being used by other units. But in our case, it's not even being used outside this method. So we can declare it locally. So once we've done that, we can immediately see that this line of code is also redundant because it's clearly not assigned. In fact, that line of code might be problematic because tmylist might actually contain who knows what. It's a local variable, and local variables, at least unmanaged variables, don't get initialized. So this could contain anything at all. So we definitely don't want that line of code. And also free and null is probably no longer necessary. We can just call free. Now one might argue that we're still stuttering a little bit in that we could call destroy directly, but typically the sort of Delphi way of doing things is to call free. So that method is now significantly improved. I think we've actually only eliminated a couple of lines of code, but it does make it a lot more obvious what's going on. Our next variation on the stutter anti-pattern is related to datasets, and it's our country dataset here, which is basically just I've gone and dragged the country table out of the interbase example and written this small fragment of code which puts all the country names into a string list and then shows those country names in a message box. And try running that, and we see that we get our list of countries. Now the bit of code is these lines here and these lines here, and if we look at what open does, I'll just control click on it. We'll see that it sets active to true, and I'll control click on active, and we see there's set active, which is what gets called when we assign something to it. And we'll see that if the value is different, it opens our data set. So that line is redundant. This would be equally valid if I had that line of code as well. So we can eliminate that and eliminate that. And I see this sort of code fragment quite often in my I've been doing a lot of refactoring lately, and that's not an uncommon Delphi anti-pattern. The next anti-pattern I want to discuss is the with statement. Now, technically the with statement is a language feature, not an anti-pattern, but it is pretty badly abused. And that is to say, if it's used at all, it's an abuse of it. So I have this very simple method, button click, and we see that it's setting the caption property to you clicked me % time, so it's basically incrementing the tag property on the button to track that. And if we run that, you might expect the button caption to change, but it doesn't, the forms caption. Now, this is because this is a FireMonkey application, and buttons don't have captions, they have a text property. So if you came across this code, you might think, well, that probably should be text, but you can't really tell. It says you clicked me, so possibly meant to be the button's caption, but hard to say. But we'll assume that for now. So it's now changing the button. I've made the button a bit small, but that's okay. Now, ideally, personally, I would like to remove this with statement. And quite often, removing with statements can be fraught with problems, and they're often better left alone until you need to do some serious changes. So I will remove it in this case, and just Control Shift B, one of my favorite shortcuts, and just eliminate those two lines of code, and you'll see that this code is still valid and will still compile. And in fact, the text property is not an option. If we still had caption, it would still be okay with the form. But we of course want to go add b dot, and if we ran that, we'll see that it didn't actually work because it's one time, because I kind of purposefully didn't do that one just to illustrate how simple it can be to to make a mistake. One of the major problem with statements is it comes down to scope, and it alters scope, and it can have odd side effects. So this is how I'd prefer to write this. I mean, you might say B is a pretty poor choice of a variable name, but in a method this small, I would say it's okay. But if it was part of something bigger, you might call it button, or the button with caption something, I don't know. Anyhow, so that's one reason not to use with statements. So that's working, and that's changing the forms caption. Now let's now assume that that's actually the behavior you wanted. Now, what can happen sometime in the future, Embarcadero, being the nice kind company that they are, decide that programmers are being confused by buttons not having a caption property and having to use text instead. So if we scroll up here, I'm going to do a little bit of hackery. It's called an interposer class. So we're interposing it between the actual version. But let's say Embarcadero have changed the T-button behavior such that it now has a caption property. And I'll just Control-Shift-C on that. And actually, we need get caption. Don't want set caption, and we actually don't want set text either. So this is a bunch of hackery. So the set text is a protected method, so I can call it directly as part of the property. But get text, if I can just go into set text, and then we have get text and go up. It's actually a private method, so I can't actually modify that one. So I've re-implemented it with get caption instead. So now when we run, not quite when we run, let's try that again. We've now gone from changing the form to the button caption or button text property, because we've introduced a caption property on it. You might think this is somewhat contrived and unlikely to really happen, but it has happened to me with relation to the Indie controls. I think it's email attachments. They added a property to one of the file attachment classes and caused me a very similar. I think I actually had a compiler error, which is kind of the best case scenario. But if they happen to be the same types, then it might compile, and run until you're executing the bit of code that you think is modifying something within the with statement, but isn't. And in this case, the kind of bad fix is to modify, rather than removing the with statement altogether, adding the self.caption, so we're looking at the forms caption rather than the buttons caption. So that's all I'm going to go on about as far as with goes. I really now, I used to use with statements quite a lot. I now hate them with a passion. I suggest you take up the same sort of attitude towards them and not use them. It is quite often better to leave with statements that are already existing in your code, because just taking them out for the sake of taking them out will often, it's very easy to get things wrong. Our next anti-pattern I'm going to call exceptions for lunch. This is where we just eat exceptions and don't do anything. So if I run this without debugging, our button does absolutely nothing, which is not very helpful. So our user is going to be very confused at this point. So we should display some sort of message. Actually, I wanted to run that without debugging, but we'll just continue. And we get error, which is yet another anti-pattern, and that is useless error dialogues. You want to be kind to your users, at least let them know somewhat what's going on. So we can enhance this marginally. Oops. By adding the message. So division by 0, that might give some indication to the user if there was a netter box, something like that, but would probably need to be a little more specific in real life. But this is a very contrived bit of code which has no meaning in itself. So yes, that's sort of the you want to do something in exceptions, ideally. I have on occasion had used this anti-pattern. It'll often be in like an on idle loop or on update in an action, where if something goes wrong, I don't want the dialog box continuously harassing the user. But otherwise, best avoided, and that's probably not a very good. You'd probably want to log the exception or something like that. Now, you'll notice this warning. So this is my next anti-pattern, and that's doing your try finally statements incorrectly. This is like I don't understand exceptions anti-pattern. The reason this is a problem is that our constructor might fail and raise an exception, in which case we'll execute our finally block, which is freeing our string list. Now, the string list at this point, if our constructor failed, is going to point to, well, whatever it was pointing to at this point, which is gibberish. So we could be trying to free some random bit of memory. And that might be somewhat undesirable. So local variables are not initialized, with the exception of managed types such as strings and interfaces. But actually, I don't know what the story is on mobile, whether that would be initialized to null. But anyway, so we of course want to alter our try finally statement to look like that, and you should be well aware of that, hopefully. I'll just briefly cover this next anti-pattern, which is accessing the form variable from within the form. Usually not a very good idea. Occasionally it's useful if you've got some sort of singleton pattern going on, but I do see it occasionally, but it's not hugely common. But it's not a good idea. And I've also creating another instance of the form and showing it. And of course, if I click on the button, it updates the time, and likewise from this form it updates this time. Now that might be what you want to achieve, but usually you'll just want to access the caption property directly, or whatever property of the form directly. And if you do need to access a instance of the form, you can use the self variable, which will allow us to, in this case I'm setting the owner of our new form we're creating to be the original form 13. And of course you can probably guess that it's now updating as expected. Next, I want to mention a pattern that irritates me greatly whenever I see it, and that's if-then statements on one line. And yes, it's nice and concise, but if I throw a breakpoint there and go to debug it, and then go step over, I have no idea if do something got executed or not. In this case, it's fairly straightforward because it's just, my bool 1 is true. It is being set down here. It's fairly obvious, but if you've got a more complicated if statement, then it could be more problematic. And if I change that so that's on separate lines, and I now step over, we know that do something is being executed. Now the magic keystroke is Control D, which is reformat, and let's go yes, and it will reformat that entire unit. Alternatively, I think it does it by selection if desired. You could probably test that fairly readily. So that formatted just those two lines, and that formatted the entire unit. So yes, Control D can help when someone has been prolific in writing big lists of if-then statements all on a single line. You don't have to go manually editing. Of course, it will depend on how your format settings are arranged. Actually, while we're on the subject of if statements, if you're writing an if statement such as like this, it's a good idea to put parentheses around what you want. In this case, and binds more tightly than or, so it's my bool 2 and 3, or my bool 1. So like thus, but had you wanted left to right evaluation, you could arrange it like so. So my bool 2 and 3 are not initialized, so they're false. So if I leave that blank, it should be true, well, false and false, or true, which is true. So do something should get executed. Demonstrate that, and it does. If we wanted left to right evaluation, would have true or false, which is true and false, which is false. So do something doesn't get executed. So which is obviously quite different. So just to avoid confusion, although they may not be required, putting parentheses in, it can be quite helpful in making it much faster to be able to read your Boolean evaluations. I have here a small anti-pattern, and that is if some condition, then raise an exception, else do something. This else is clearly not actually necessary, because if the exception is raised, then it's not going to get to there anyway. So you can just eliminate the else, and then you don't need the begin or end as well. And I see this kind of thing, assuming that something happens after an exception or an exit call. It'd be the same situation if we do exit there. And I've seen that quite often, and it's really irritating. This other bit of code, you've got if something, if something, and then you've got this sort of cascade of end statements down the back end of your function. I find that it is often much easier to read if you slightly change things around, so that you go, if not, then exit, and then you can get rid of that begin and end, and we can do the same and if, then, and Control D. So that's kind of a common simplification that can be made in certain types of functions that are laid out with these if or cascading if statements. The downside of doing this is that you've got multiple exit points, and some people think that's hideous. I don't tend to mind it so much, but what I do find annoying is that if I then go to refactor, like extracting a method, we can't do it because there's an exit call, and likewise with statements, they're similarly annoying in that respect. So this little project is to demonstrate using string list as a list of objects, which I've seen numerous times, and I don't know why, but basically in the form create, we're creating a string list, and in the form destroy, we're freeing the string list and all its associated objects. And we have a button which adds an object, and a button which pulls out the last one and shows what it is. And our little something objects just contain a date, which gets set in the constructor to now. So it's a really boring application. So you can click add a few times and then show last, and it shows when it was added. So not particularly exciting. Of course, there are far better lists that we can use to store our t-somethings. There's t-list, t-object list, and of course if you've got a recent version of Delphi, I think it's 2009 or later, you can use generics. System generics.collections. And so rather than being a t-string list, it's a t-object list of t-something, However, our t something needs to be declared before our form. So that's of course going to propagate a whole lot of changes that we need to make, which are fairly straightforward. This just becomes add, and we're adding our t something to retrieve a something. We just reference it directly, and we don't need to cast it as anything because it's already a t something from our list. We need to change our constructor, and we actually, I've made a mistake here. I haven't actually freed our list, so there was a bit of a memory leak, but I was at least freeing the contents of the list. So I should have had after that t. Oops. As we're using a t object list, by default in the constructor there's a parameter owns objects, and it's by default true. And if you set it to false, you have to free the all the objects, which would be doing fairly straightforward. And of course, we don't need to do the as. But we don't need this at all because it'll automatically free our objects. So that's a much simpler implementation, and it's type safe and easy to read and all those good things. And of course, being easy to read, I managed to spot the fact that I'd forgotten to free the date list. So that's my gripe about using t-string list as a generic or non-generic container for objects or other things, such as, even worse, casting the t object to a pointer to a record or something like that. But anyhow, so to finish up, I want to cover two other little anti-patterns. The first is mixing presentation and business logic, basically putting your business logic in your forms. And I have let's run it and see how it works. Click on show names, and it grabs a list of the fish common names. So if we look at this, we see that we're accessing data module 14 and looking at our t-biolife table. It's a t-table. Very much call this another Delphi anti-pattern using the BDE. It's pretty much obsolete now and best avoided, but there are lots and lots of applications that still use it, basically because it still works, which is one of the things that Embarcadero have been quite good at doing, keeping Delphi code working between different versions of Delphi. So what we want to do is shift this out of here and throw it into our data module. And we see that we're accessing data module.tbiolife blah 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 a lot, and this is also violating the Law of Demeter, which, if you want to look up what that is, Nick Hodges has a very good post on explaining it, and it's basically saying that if you're going in too deep into various bits and pieces, you should probably be dividing up your responsibilities in your classes a bit better, or shifting the code. Anyway, I won't go into it. I'm going to shift all that and create a new function called get common names, return a string, and paste that back in. And instead of doing a show message, we'll set the result. And of course, so just tidy that up like so, and this becomes something like that. So works the same, and we've shifted the business logic of obtaining common names out of the table from the form into the data module. The final anti-pattern I'm going to cover is mixing presentation logic with business logic, which is the exact opposite of our previous example. And in this case, if we run the app again, we'll see that the form's caption is being updated based on the common name. And this is being done in our data module in the BioLife, or the data set after scroll event. And we see here that we're updating the caption. Now, because we are referencing our form, it means our data module is not portable. We can't reuse it if we wanted to build a FireMonkey version of this app, or intraweb, or some sort of back-end service, or a console application, or any number of other possibilities. So we want to eliminate this code and have some other mechanism such that we don't reference, so remove that, unit 13, which is our form. The mechanism we're going to use is live bindings, and if I bring up the live binding designer, we want to link our common name to the form caption, and you'll see that we have no form 13 here. So, and if I go show hide elements, our form 13 is not present there either. So what I'm going to do is set up the binding manually. So we'll need a bind scope. No, we won't. We'll need a bind source DB and a binding list. And we'll just hook up our data source so that we get our data set hooked up. And we want to create a new binding, and we want to link a property to a field. So our data source is our bind source, and the field name is, of course, common name. Our component is form 13, which is it grizzles a little bit about, but we can still do it and grab the caption. And if we run that, our form caption does in fact resolve to our common name in our data set. Thank you for taking the time to watch. I hope you've sat there thinking, what a big waste of time. Why would anyone do any of that? If not, then at least you might have learnt some new coding ideas. I'm Alister Christie from LearnDelphi.tv.
Is there a way to reference the with object, i.e. with Cinder as t-button begin tag equals some value in the tag assignment? Is there a way to reference that with object?
So they're asking, say something like, with button 1 do something or other like that. Is that what's being asked effectively?
Yeah, it's saying, so with Cinder as t-button begin tag equals some value in,
yes.
in the tag assignment. No?
No. Generally, just I think this is a in I think C# there's a using statement.
Yes.
So using something or other, which is probably a much better way of doing a sort of equivalent with, but no such thing in Delphi. I think you just don't use with statements at all.
Yeah.
This is my general opinion these days. How do you feel about with statements?
I would agree with statements are... It's one of those things that as soon as you think there's an exception, you find out you shouldn't have done it. It's like, oh, this is a great place for a with statement. Nope, don't do it. Anyway, here, Alister Briggs says...
There were plenty of people out there saying, you know, with statements make it more readable and that kind of stuff. Only to the point when you have to make a change.
Yeah. You know what I do use is if I know I'm going to be referencing some instance that has maybe a long name or it's nested deeply, is I'll make a local reference to it. and just
Yes.
use that one.
Yeah.
And that
Likewise.
just maybe make it X or something, really tiny, and just use that, or put it in refactor it into a sub method or something like that. Okay, I may have missed it, but the reason not to use with statements in form handlers is to talk about another GUI element rather than a non-GUI element. Despite .close being overused, this kind of programming is not a worry for with. But the reason not to use with statements in form handlers. I'm not sure if that's a question or a statement.
I didn't really get that. I think it sounded like a statement.
Yeah. Not using with statements is the part that stood out to me. Sounds like a good idea. Where are the hotkey definitions, shortcuts like Control-Shift-C for Delphi defined?
I know there's been a few blog posts about them. I've actually got, I think for Code Rage 3, I did a IDE hints and tips, which is on LearnDelphi.tv. It's like 45 minutes of keystrokes and what have you. But I know there's a Delphi wiki somewhere, delphi.wiki.com or something like that has a huge list, and I've referenced that occasionally. But I know a number of people have blogged about the various shortcut keys.
I think Carrie put a list together. Maybe I'm remembering wrong. Can Embarcadero implement an interface in the programmer's brain and have this implemented by default? I read that these same mistakes in other people's code every day, and I still get an R coming up. Yes, that would be fabulous. I will go talk to them about that right now.
I think that'd be a very good idea. I mean, I've just covered a very small number of anti-patterns that I've, that are really quite common. I've been compiling another list. I might do a series of videos on other little code snippets which just disappear everywhere and are best avoided.
Use with statements to unbind dependence on units. Okay. You may want to mention that using a with also makes the debugging mouse hover over capability limited. I use local variables instead of with statements, even for this very reason alone. Yep, exactly. Exactly.
Indeed.
Okay, I think, Alister, what do you recommend for? Oh, I just got a bunch of questions came in. What do you recommend for storing a list of pair values? T-object list, hash array, T-strings, etc.
Well, T-dictionary is quite useful.
Yep, that's what I usually use.
In the system.generics.collections unit.
This is minor, but I think the use of string constant in file by name is an anti-pattern. I mean, if we have persistent file names equal tbiolife field by name, CDS test field name is better than tbio. Okay, so it's saying use a reference to the name instead of putting the name in quotes as a string literal.
Well, you can get the metadata, you can get the field names, or you can get the strings.
Yeah, I think that's what they're saying is that you should use that from the definition instead of by hard coding it.
Is there something in the background?
There are downsides to doing that, though.
Pardon?
If you're importing all the metadata into your or fields, if your field structure changes in the background, you can run into issues.
Yep, that's true.
Commonly changing your database.
Is there noise coming in from your background, Alister?
Yes, I'm in a busy room, unfortunately. So
okay, no problem.
Just want to make sure it wasn't something on our end because we've had.
No, I know. For example, you might want to check to see the column names, field names, types, because all those things can change on you. If somebody gives you does a database update, right? It changes the data type of a column. So there's all sorts of things you can do to harden your code to do test types and names to make sure they're okay.
Here's a good question for you from Martin. It says, I've stayed clear of live bindings because I dislike hiding more functionality out of the code. Do you find that using live bindings makes the app harder to debug?
I'm mostly using Delphi XE and XE2, so not doing a lot of live bindings
in
my day-to-day work. Well, I would like to be. I think it's really cool. I've been thinking about it, and it does. You are sort of hiding some of your implementation in your forms, and it becomes a bit more difficult. But I think over time you'll get to know to search your DFM files and things like that for that sort of stuff.
I mean, the live binding system is using enhanced RTTI, right? So you could even create your own bind expressions in your own binding class instance and populate it. You don't have to use the design time live binding designer and wizard. You could query, there's many examples for iterating through the type information at runtime, and you could build up your own binding expressions if you wanted to, if you want to build a whole dynamic system. But for simple things where your data's not changing, right, your fields, your component UIs aren't changing, where you're wiring things together, you can see it all in the live binding designer visually and do a visual inspection.
And I think you can use the same argument not to use data binding at all. So you don't use your data sets or data aware controls for the same reasons. So I don't think there's a too big issue on using live bindings in that respect.
Yep. So here's one that says we avoid the usage of free and nil at all costs. We think it is a good practice. Can you confirm a case when you would need a free and nil?
Well, occasionally you don't. You might be reusing a variable for the same purpose, and you want to set it to nil. I mean, you can call free and then assign it to nil if you want to be explicit about it. But that would be a case where I'd use free and nil. And in some respects, it's kind of, I'm sometimes a bit paranoid about programming, and assigning nil to a variable does mean that if I do accidentally reuse it, try and access some property or something like that on it, it is going to generate an exception fairly quickly, rather than it might still work.
Tim McKay says, I find free and nil is best when doing multi-threading.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
One way live binding can be useful is for rapid prototyping. It's interesting because I remember at one point I did not use any data-bound controls way back. It was like Delphi
code
4, like Delphi 5 days. Did it all in code. But then as I learned more about data binding and when, how it worked and when it worked and the way it worked, I find I'm using it more now. I think that I was talking to somebody the other day that talked about live binding. They said, I don't use live binding because I don't understand exactly how it works. And so I could definitely see that being a issue. Okay, how about parentheses, cinder as t-button, close parentheses, dot tag equals 9.
Sorry, it's a one-line width? Was that?
No, there's no width. It just says, how about, open parentheses, cinder as t-button, close parentheses, dot tag, colon equals 9.
That's probably fine.
Yeah, the tag property,
correctly.
The most unused, I think, property, right? One of the most unused.
Yeah, possibly one of the worst abused as well. People putting pointers in there.
Using it for memory storage, for
evil things.
Pointers.
Yep,
Yeah.
I've seen that.
Which is, of course, it's an integer, and so that's not 64-bit compatible and all sorts of interesting things these days. So,
I think it changed.
It's a native
when
now.
Delphi 64 became native it. Yeah.
I believe it's a native it. So here's something that says, does not require this unit to use the unit for some object with global singleton dot get some object to do. Okay, so that's saying this is the reason you would use with statements, but in that case I would recommend using a local instance. Do you know if the internal implementation of the generic t-list or t-object list is closer to a vector pattern or list pattern? I know that in the C++ world there has been a lot of research on the performance of both in the STL, and that surprisingly vectors are faster than lists.
Okay, I have no clue on that. But,
You got the source code, take a look at it.
And I know in the C++ coverage last year, my conversation with Bjorn Stustrup He had a lot of very nice things to say about t-vector or vector.
What is a real world use for the tag property? What I use it for, and Alister, you could say what you use it for, is occasionally I have want to have some sort of loose coupling of components on a form, and so I can assign a group of components the same tag, and then I know those components work together. I've done the same thing with the name before too. You could also, for example, maybe if you have a button that you want to increment the number of clicks, you could store that value in the tag property. What do you think?
I don't think there's any real use for that property. Personally, I have used it in the past to store sort of some integer information about buttons and things like that. And sometimes I've done, I have to say, in the past, done evil things like having a case statement, case of button.tag, do various things, which is not very good, but I don't think it's a particularly useful property.
I saw an example once where on a timer event where you might be doing a lot of processing during a timer interval where you set the tag to say you're still in the timer handler doing something so that the timer doesn't re-enter. If you have a longer running set of logic, if you've got a very fast timer. But that was the only case where I saw somebody do something like that versus using some semaphore.
Right. Presumably a variable will work just as well.
Yeah.
In that case, a form variable or something.
Okay, it looks like we're almost done here. I think we've got, when we add a component to the appropriate Delphi unit, it gets automatically added to the uses clause. Is there a shortcut key or similar to do the contrary, e.g. take away any components, and we would like to automatically clean the uses clause things?
Okay, what I can recommend there is part of the CN Wizards, if you go to cnpack.org, I think, CNPack has a usage cleaner, which I've used quite a lot and works reasonably well. It will determine what units aren't being used and remove them.
GExperts does as well, although I haven't used it in a while, but last time I remember using it, I remember it working really well.